Always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And as you know, I like conversations. So I will just make a few points and then we'll get into a conversation. And I will try to stay as long as I can because I always really enjoy this interaction. First of all, every tweet from now on until we get rid of this dictatorship in Uganda, you should make sure that you tag, that you include at least a cropping of the headline. Two very important headlines right now. Uganda president's son boasts of torturing opponent's bodyguard. I think that's the headline. It was in the Times of London. And it's attached to one of the sample tweets that I sent to Sister Dorcas. So you can take a look at that. And the other headline is, Uganda Army commander says he wants to behead opposition leader. A number of newspapers carried that headline, including Reuters. And of course, here we are referring to the maniac, the psychopath, and the sociopath, General Muhoozi, son of the senior dictator, Yoweri Museveni. So that headline, make sure you include it in everything that you tweet. We want the whole world to know what is going on in Uganda. And we want the World Bank and the IMF to know that we will not allow them to get away with trying to normalize torture and terror in Uganda, because this is state terrorism, right? What we have in Uganda. So if the World Bank and the IMF are financing state terrorism, that means they are associates and accomplices in state terrorism. So always make sure that you crop that headline and include it in everything that you tweet. And it's had impact. I noticed that when I use that headline, I attach them, that the tweets get a lot more traffic. And definitely, the regime is concerned. You notice now the dictator himself now has started to come out more and to speak in public. And his brother, Salim Saleh, has come out more and starting to speak in public. And you know, right now, they're trying to gang up on the ambassador of Germany to Uganda, trying to use him as a scapegoat, alleging that he's interfering in Uganda's internal affairs, for daring to say that you have crossed the line when Muhoozi was boasting about torturing Eddie Mutwe. And of course, they're also looking toward January or February, whenever we have the election. They want to try to pre-silence any criticism from these European countries that finance Uganda, so that by January, February, whenever they have the election, they've been bashing Germany for months now. And then after the dictatorship steals the election, they think that by that time, Germany and the other European countries would have been intimidated by the many months of bashing, and they would remain silent and not criticize the election theft. So we also have to think ahead. And that is why we have to push back. So for example, there's a recent tweet, I don't know if it's from yesterday or today, the senior dictator, Yoweri Museveni, has a picture of him with the German ambassador sitting across from him and saying they had a productive meeting. So I tweeted my reply. In my reply, I just included the cropping of that headline. Uganda president's son boasts of torturing opponent. That's all. I didn't even say another word. I just cropped that image and I sent that as my reply. And of course, the Twitter handle includes Dictator Museveni's. I don't know if there's an interruption. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because I thought something happening to the screen. You can hear me? Okay, very good.
Yes, I can. I was trying to get your tweets up, but yes, I can.
Okay. Okay, no problem. So I tweeted that as my response. And also I made sure that I added the Twitter handle of the German ambassador, the German chancellor, the British prime minister, the French president, the International Criminal Court, the French ambassador to Uganda, the British High Commissioner to Uganda. I included all of that in my response to that propaganda by Museveni that they had a productive meeting. So these are just the preliminary things that I would encourage sisters and brothers that we do on a consistent basis. So now, before I focus on the World Bank and IMF, I would like to make one more comment. We should constantly remind our sisters and brothers in the armed forces, the military and the police, that they are part of the Ugandan family. Let's keep reminding them that, because put yourself in their position, sisters and brothers. If you joined the military in Uganda, would you be proud to see the commander of the Ugandan army boasting of torturing another human being? Just think about that. How could you be proud of being an institution like that? So let's always keep that in mind. And let's talk to them. Let's talk to them. Let's make sure they hear. We remind them, you are being misguided. Don't torture us. Don't obey illegal orders. You're part of the family. When this dictatorship is gone, we are going to have to live together. Keep repeating that in your messages, and it will start getting through. I noticed one time when I made a short video commentary, and I said, sisters and brothers in the armed forces, you are part of the Ugandan family. Don't torture Bobby Wine. Don't shoot at him. That's when they was shot on the leg. Because when this dictatorship is gone, guess what? We are going to have to live together, and this is going to be our leader. It got massive traffic, but it also got massive pushback by the dictatorship. So the dictatorship is very concerned and does not want us to start reaching out to the armed forces and the police. So in fact, we must escalate that and encourage them to stop obeying illegal orders. And we can keep hinting to them, do the right thing, and they will understand what that means. Okay, so now let me say a few words about the World Bank and IMF, and then we can get into conversation. The World Bank and IMF were founded in 1944, just toward the close of World War II. And their objective was to help restore and rebuild the economies of Europe that had been devastated as a result of that war. In fact, the official name of the World Bank is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That is the official name. And they succeeded. Europe's economy was restored. Of course, they also had the Marshall Plan program, where the United States gifted billions of dollars to Europe as a grant. They were able to rebuild their cities, their infrastructure, their factories, and Europe recovered. But then after that, they found out that they could use the World Bank and the IMF to push their political agenda, and particularly in countries in Africa and in other parts of the world where they refer to developing economies. And that's a misnomer, because in fact, many of these are underdeveloping economies. They're going backward. So for example, in Africa, industrialization has been regressing, lower than even when it was in the 1960s. But they found out that they can control these countries politically. And when did they find out? As early as 1957, the World Bank loaned money to Ghana when Ghana wanted to build the Volta River project to produce energy from Akosombo. I forget what the amount was, but they loaned money to Ghana. But then they didn't like, the US, Britain, France, they didn't like Nkrumah, because Nkrumah had a vision, which was to turn Africa into not a dependency, but into a global power as well, because Africa has all the resources. And Nkrumah said, we can do that if we form a United States of Africa. So they said, oh, you know, this is a very dangerous African. So there's a website for the State Department archives where you can read all these memos and documents. And one of the memos, I forgot who wrote it, but it was some official writing to the White House and saying, The World Bank has approved a loan to Ghana to build the hydroelectric project. And the money has already been approved, but not yet disbursed. If we could delay the disbursing of the money, it could create problems for Ghana's economy. This memo was written in 1965. And if there's problem in Ghana's economy, then the public could become disaffected and start protesting against Nkrumah. And then the armed forces and the police may intervene and overthrow Nkrumah. Can you imagine? This is the US discussing how they can abuse the World Bank. This is in 1957. And now we have in Uganda doing the opposite, financing not a progressive who has a vision of Africa, but the most reactionary, brutal regime that we have on the African continent today. So for Nkrumah, they punish him because he had a good vision for Africa. In Uganda, they reward this tyranny who is destroying Uganda, destroying East Africa, and setting a terrible example of Africa. So, and by the way, Nkrumah was overthrown. The memo was written in 65. Nkrumah was overthrown the next year in 1966. But to his credit, at least he built Akasombo, which is benefiting Ghana and other West African countries, even up today. Okay, so that was the first instance where they found out they could use the World Bank to control African countries. And then, of course, things became worse in the 1980s. In 1982, only 2 African countries had an agreement with the IMF, which is the sister institution of the World Bank. So the way it works is this. If you want money from the World Bank, they tell you, get a deal with the IMF first, International Monetary Fund. And the IMF says, okay, we will give you credit, we'll give you financing, provided you do this, 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 this. And this includes cutting down on civil service, meaning you're going to increase poverty and unemployment. Cutting down subsidies on education, meaning now students whose parents have no money have to pay school fees. Cutting down subsidies on healthcare. Cutting down subsidies on food. Cutting support for your farmers, agriculture, and devaluing your currency, making your currency weaker. These are the conditions they give you, and most African countries are so desperate they agree, and then after that they get more money from the World Bank. So in 1980, only 2 African countries had such an agreement. By 1982, 48 African countries had an agreement, meaning by that time, Africa was effectively recolonized by these institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, and they called it structural adjustment. That became very prevalent in the 1980s. So we went back to effective colonization, really. You know, now the European governors have been removed, but now you have new institutions. You have the World Bank and the IMF, and instead of having European governors, you have even something which is much better. You have African European governors, people like Museveni, you know, because in the past you could say, oh, look at what this European governor is doing in Uganda. Look at what this European governor is doing in Kenya. Look at these racists. Well, look at what they're doing to Africans. Now, you cannot say, look at these racists, because Museveni is a so-called African, a so-called black, you see? So now they have the best system they could have ever devised. Control Africans using another African like Museveni to enslave other Africans. That's what we have in Uganda. We are enslaved to Museveni and Muhoozi, and they are rewarded for enslaving us by the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank and the IMF can never help us develop. Just think about it logically. I want you to think it carefully. How can a capitalist country like the United States help us to become other capitalist competitors to compete with the United States? Does that make sense logically? Look at the US is always arguing with China because China, even though they claim their governance system is communist or socialist, they have a thriving capitalist system in China. Of course, it's a bit more well managed than in the United States. So the level of income gap that the United States has and the mass poverty in the United States, you don't have that in China because their system is a little more managed. But do you think the United States wants Africa to become another China? Of course not. So then you have to ask yourself, so why do they lend money? Why do they lend money to African countries, to the World Bank and IMF? To keep you dependent upon them, as I've just articulated. China did not become a superpower by going to the World Bank and IMF and then having the IMF tell them, oh, China, cut down spending on education, cut down spending on social services, cut down spending on health. Of course not. In fact, China became a power by doing the exact opposite. So, for example, literacy in China around the 1960s was like maybe 10% or something, or maybe 12%. Now it's like 98%, something like that. Because they put money in education, they realize you cannot develop a country with illiterate people. How's that possible? Yet in Uganda, they're telling us, oh, cut down support for education so we can give you a loan. So in fact, the prescription they give us is the opposite of what we need to develop, which shows you that their objective is not really to see us thrive and compete with the West. And that makes sense. If I was running the World Bank or the IMF and I am a Western leader, why would I want to develop competition? So I would make sure that we lend them just enough to keep them dependent on us. It's almost like somebody on the dole. Every other week they come to get that welfare check. So you keep them alive. But can a person like that ever compete with you? And it's, in Africa, it's even much more sad. Why? Because we have the resources that they need to develop, you see? But they won't allow us to use our own minerals to industrialize. And then one final point. If the World Bank and IMF were there to help us develop, how come, since they started giving the loan to Nkrumah in the 1950s, how come there's not one single developed economy on the continent of Africa? Think about that. And then you know how they explain that, right? They say, oh, because you guys are incompetent. Oh, you guys are corrupt. Okay, if we're incompetent, if we are corrupt, why are you still lending us money then? Why? Why are you lending us money? And that should let you know the real reason and purpose why they lend us money. They lend us money to prevent us from developing, not to make us develop. Because if we had source of financing from somewhere else that did not tell us cut down education, cut down healthcare, cut down subsidy for food, we would take that money and we would build factories in Africa and we would industrialize. Industrialization is not very complicated. The technology is very widespread. China, as I said in my last presentation, in 1960, the per capita income of China was $90 US, 90. Ghana's was over 180. Double that of China. Just think about that. That's not a very long time ago, you know? But today, China is a superpower because China is not dependent on the World Bank and IMF. China uses its resources to develop, and now in the last 20 years, it's been using Africa's resources to develop China. So Museveni, and just 1 second, I think I'm getting an interruption back here, and then I'll be able to wrap up. Museveni and his son Muhoozi are clearly obstacles to our development, but they work in the interest of the West. And that is why they're sustained by the World Bank. But we will not allow that. We will not allow them to normalize terrorism in Uganda. And Museveni and his son, I call him Psycho Muhoozi, are giving us the instruments that we need to do effective mobilization and effective messaging. So I go back to that headline. That is the best headline, a gift for us. Uganda president's son, boast of torturing opponent. If we had our own people doing propaganda, we could not even come up with a better headline than that from the Times of London. And that's why I say every message we send out, attach that clip. It's already doing effective work for us and damage to the regime. That is why in the last few weeks, Museveni, as I said, has been more coming out. But anytime Museveni says something, respond to him as well with a clip of what his son said. And then in a month or two, you're going to see the impact it's going to be having. If Museveni is talking to somebody from the European Commission, you don't have to say much. Just include a clip. Uganda president's son, boast of torturing opposition in all our communication. Let's be on the same page, and we will see the impact that we need. So sisters and brothers, thank you. And now let's open it up for a conversation. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you. Ali Madi Milton. Comrade.
I think
wonderful.
you're muted, sister.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay.
Apologies.
You see, in whatever we want as Ugandans, it's your first responsibility. These foreigners, these people, these funders, to act, to react, to stop what they are doing in Africa or in Uganda, it's upon us, Africans, Ugandans, to look into their faces and we tell them the reality. You see, this is what is taking place in Uganda. This is what's happening. Why are you doing this? Bino bye bigenda maaso abakulembeze baffe bannakyemalira bakola bino mu ggwanga lyaffe mu nsi yaffe ate mu mawa ssente okututulugunya. You are paying for our torture. You are paying for our death. You are paying for our miss. Bro, tulina okubagamba nga tubagambira ddala lwe bajja okwekomako. Niwe tutabagambe ntubasirikirira bo bajja kwongera okugenda maaso babbo kye baagala kigende maaso wetutu. Ate ba dictator bo basigala bafunamu babagenda okufuna ssente ezo ne bagula drone ne bagula amasasi ne bagula buli kimu ekyokwongera otutulugunya otuteeka mu mbeera bo gye beetaaga. N'olwekyo buvunaanyizibwa bwo okubaako kyokola ku lw'eggwanga lyo.
I do have a bit of technical. Comrade Ismail, please take it on. Thank you so much, Professor, for this. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yes, Professor, thank you very much, as always. Very informative. I was making notes, and also I'll be amplifying the tweets. Let me go somewhere where I can switch on the video. So we've got Comrade Mimi. Comrade Mimi wants to speak. Please, Comrade Mimi, unmute and speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, and thank you so much, all the comrades that are here.
Thank you.
My question to you is, I really love the model of China, the way they were able to get to themselves to where they are right now. I think in my little knowledge about what they did is that they kind of shut themselves to the world. But one thing they did, they sent out their young people out in all these Western, they got the knowledge, came back, shut themselves up and developed their country.
Right.
And unlike Africa, the difference, and this is the question I have for you, is like now that you see everywhere Africa is turning to Russia and China.
Right.
What is the difference? Turning away from the West and now turning back to China and Russia. I think we are getting back to the same thing. There's no difference. Given the dictators we have on the continent, it's the same, no difference to me.
Right. Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's
Okay. Okay. That's a good question that I've actually had conversations with many comrades about. And the argument they're making is that you're going from a very severe level of dependency with the West to a dependency which is not as malign with Russia and China. And of course, in many of these instances, it's the leadership that is redirecting this type of relationship. And what they're doing is essentially using it to sustain their governments. You see? And my argument has always been that if the relationship with China, in particular, not so much Russia, because, I mean, Russia, in many instances, is providing armed intervention to help sustain some of these governments, particularly the ones in West Africa. And of course, in that case, there's some sympathy for those governments, particularly the governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Because what they did is they expelled the French influence, because the France was controlling their economy and their governments as well. Neo-colonial states, the classic neo-colonial states. But they realized they could not just expel the French and without the ability to sustain their governments, you see? And that is why those countries in particular moved toward more cooperation with Russia as well as China. But in these particular three countries, they're doing something different. So for example, in Burkina Faso, and this is why the West really was trying to put pressure on Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is taking control of its economy, you see? So for example, the gold industry is saying, no, and they renegotiated the contracts. It has to benefit us. How can you be profiting from our gold and we, the country that own the gold, we are not getting anything to build our economies? And what they're also doing is they're building factories to start using their own resources to start some level at least of industrial production. So that's what they're doing. And then in Niger, which also kicked out the French, Niger is one of the major producers of uranium in the world. And France, its power, energy for its economy, it is about 75% from nuclear energy. So France has a per capita income of somewhere around maybe 50,000. Niger has a per capita income of a few $100s. How is that possible? You know, it's possible because France is has been stealing the uranium for decades from Niger. So Niger is changing that relationship as well and stopped exporting uranium to France. So I think in these particular three countries, the way they're reorienting the relationship, I think has been somewhat positive compared to a country like, I think it's Central African Republic, doing nothing to take control of its economy, but also invited support from Russia because the regime wants to sustain itself in power. So I would like to try to find some nuance in terms of that relationship. But my own position is this. Many African countries have good relations with China, particularly economic dealings. But China is exploiting these countries. Okay, China does build infrastructure. It has built roads, it has built bridges, it has built schools, universities, it built the headquarters of the African Union. But why is China not helping Africa to industrialize? You see? That, to me, would be the true measure of having a positive, beneficial relationship with China. China has industrialized since the 1960s. China has the technology. But also, to be fair, that is not up to China. So, for example, if we had a NUP government in Uganda and we had a President Bobby Wine, and he said, China, we will continue working with you, our economic relationship, but instead of just giving us money for our resources, we want 50% of the compensation to be in the form of technology, right? So instead of X amount being paid, I don't know how they use whether they use Chinese currency or they use the dollar in their transactions, but whatever they use, we want 50% of that X amount to be in money and 50% in technology. You know, help us build these factories that can use our copper or our coffee to process the coffee in Uganda, process the tea in Uganda, and then sell it to the world as packaged products, which brings much more money to Uganda. That's what I want to see in all our African countries in terms of our relationship in China. The West will never help us to industrialize. They don't want us to compete with them. But China, you were an underdeveloped country in the 1960s. You know, you suffered with us. In fact, we helped you, China. Remember? China was not a part of the United Nations because they had Taiwan, which was you know, basically a puppet of the United States. It was African countries who kept demanding that China must be given a seat in the UN. China ultimately got seated in the UN. China became a member, permanent member of the Security Council because of support of Africa. So now, China, we are reminding you what support we gave you. Of course, you supported us too. You gave us weapons and training to fight against colonialism. But now take us to the next level. Help us to industrialize. So a NUP government could make that kind of demand. But of course, this dictatorship of Museveni and Muhoozi, so long as they're getting something in their pocket, they don't care, you know? So thank you for that very important question.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Comrade Mimi. We also have a question here, which says, to what extent does Western government still influence African political decision, especially during the election and or civil unrest?
Yes. Okay, that's a very important question. You just don't believe it. That's a very important question because that goes to the crux of the matter.
Yeah.
It's no coincidence that the World Bank is resuming lending to Uganda a few months before the election. And that's why we must not accept that. That's completely intolerable. This is an endorsement of tyranny in Uganda, and then it is outright support and financing for it because the regime is under tremendous financial pressure right now. So the World Bank is throwing them a life jacket by resuming this kind of lending, going toward the election. There's so much pressure. So now they're going to help the dictatorship ease the pressure. So that's why we must reject it. We must keep protesting against this development on a daily basis and try to get it reversed or suspended, at least until after the election. Why could they not even wait until after the election? So the person who asked that question really hit the nail, put the hammer on the nail by that question.
Yes, thank you. Also, finally, do you think the reason why Uganda is how it is because of our location, for example, next to the Congo? Minerals can be snuck into Uganda like that, and then they get put into the world market. Could you please touch more a little bit on that? And finally, a little bit more on the structural adjustment program, because we're not really too sure how it actually works and how it affected us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. It's the location. Uganda has been stealing about $500 million worth of gold and other resources from Congo. In fact, last year, I understand it was more than $1 billion, you see? And these resources are not used in Uganda, they're shipped overseas. So, you know, Western governments are essentially corporations, as we know, as those of us who have lived in the West. The people who are in government are people that from corporations. And in fact, now in the United States, people who have been following the politics since the new president came on board. You see, in fact, there's no firewall now between corporations and government, you see? So corporations, they want to maximize profit. If you can maximize profit by allowing Uganda to steal the resources from the Congo, and you're not going to have to pay tax to the government, the central government in the Congo, but you have your own deal with Uganda, which of course must be much more profitable. Otherwise, you would be working with the government in Kinshasa. You see, so they'll factor that in to have Uganda steal the resources or to have Rwanda steal the resources. This is much more efficient, much more profitable. You see, not caring about the human cost. So that is why, of course, you know, Rwanda does not want to let go of Eastern Congo, because Rwanda also, similar to Uganda, exports more than $1 billion of minerals that are not located in Rwanda. So this relationship is very profitable to Uganda and Rwanda and to the Western corporations that we work with, but that they work with. See, but so the job is ours to expose this nefarious relationship through media, through protests, through social media, and get partners in these countries, because we have very potential partners, young people in the West who are not familiar with what's going on. We have to get them to join us in the protest. We have to get them to engage with their elected representatives and says, no, I don't want to be a part of this. At least they still have that, you know? And people, let me give you an example. There was a sense that only negativity is being rewarded. So we have the election of the current US president. So even decent people were getting discouraged and thinking, oh, it seems that only negativity is being rewarded. Now, I don't know how many of you are following what is going on in New York politics. New York is a major city. New York is a city with a budget of just the city government alone, the economy like $60 billion or something like that. Yeah, much more bigger than even Uganda's economy, right? So they have election of mayor going on right now. And what they do is New York is primarily Democratic city. So whoever wins the primary is most likely going to win the election for mayor in November. So we had a candidate a few weeks ago, nobody even knew his name. You know, Zoran Mamdani is the son of Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, who many of you, of course, know teachers at Makerere. Zoran is his son. He's born in Uganda, but he grew up in the US. And he has ran a very effective campaign, going to the ordinary people, knocking from door to door to door and using social media in a very creative way. The candidate who was leading him by 40 points at one point, you know, his name is Andrew Cuomo. He used to be the governor of New York State. And then he had to resign. He had there were women alleged sexual harassment against him. So he resigned years ago. Now he has made a comeback, and many wealthy corporations and rich people are supporting him. So that's why he was leading by 40 points. But the young Mamdani went from every street that he could walk on. He started getting people to support him. And now he's now leading Cuomo, and his possibility of him winning. So why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this to reinforce the power of organizing and coming together. Never get discouraged. Don't ever think we cannot have impact because the other side has more visibility. No, it is up to us to increase our visibility and become effective. and use the tools that the regime itself is providing to us, such as those very damaging headlines. Uganda president's son boasts of torturing opposition leader. You cannot get any better than that. Now, the person also had a question about structural adjustment. So think about this. In the 1960s, a few African countries, including Uganda, had one of the best healthcare systems. You could go to a clinic, the doctors would be there, medicines would be there, and would not have to be in Kampala. Even the regional hospitals were very well equipped, very well run. The schools, very well run. Makerere was the pride, not only of East Africa, but the entire continent of Africa and even the world. The roads were efficient. Now you have an institution coming to you saying, if you want a loan from us, we want you to stop giving money to your education system. We want you to stop subsidizing your healthcare system. So now that we have the opposite, we have people who are dying because they come to the hospital, they don't have money, they're not allowed to enter the hospital. Women giving birth because outside the hospital because they're not allowed to go inside the hospital. And some of them die during the delivery and their children die. We have an education system that is not producing the kind of scholars that we are producing in the 1960s and 1970s. And all of that is because of structural adjustment. You see, if they really wanted us to develop, they could have done it a long time ago. Go back and do the research about how Europe was destroyed through World War II. Many of you have seen the images of those cities in ruin. Berlin, completely reduced to rubble, right? Look at Berlin today. Look at the German economy today, one of the leading economies in Europe. The same Germany that had fought against the West, including the United States, you know, and caused World War II caused the death of about 60 million people, 6-0. The same Germany became a beneficiary and they helped recover its economy. So you're telling us that over the 60 years that Africa has been independent, you could not really help develop Africa? Of course they could, but they won't. Because so long as we're dependent, they can continue to get the raw materials that they want for cheap. And that is why they would rather have a Yoweri Museveni and a Muhoozi running Uganda instead of a Bobby Wine and a NUP government running Uganda. So that is, in a way, the summary explanation of structural adjustment.
Yes, thank you. We've got a question from Comrade Mimi. She's asking, sorry about the noise. She's asking about the president of Tanzania arresting opposition and also people disappearing. Could you please touch on that for us, please, Professor? Thank you.
Yes, of course. I've tweeted against that. I've tweeted, and in fact, I would not be surprised if, in fact, Ugandan agents are involved in the kidnapping. Recently, you saw the kidnapping of the Kenyan activist, as well as the Ugandan major human rights personality, Tahire. They were kidnapped, they were raped, and then they were dumped on the borders of their respective countries, Uganda and Kenya. And this type of activity does not even have the fingerprints of Tanzania. It is so unusual for Tanzanian security forces to behave like that. It is much more consistent with the behavior of Ugandan operatives. And it would not be shocking if Tanzania has allowed Ugandan operatives to do that, because we now know that Kenya has allowed it to happen. Dr. Besigye was kidnapped from Nairobi in November 2024. Kidnapped from Kenya by Ugandan operatives. So I would not be shocked if Tanzania has now done the same thing that Kenya has done, which is to allow Ugandan operatives to operate in Tanzania, which of course is tragic. So, it takes a special quality type leader like Julius Nyerere, you see, who could have stayed president until he died, you see? But he cared for his country. And at one point he realized he would start facing only negativity if he had stayed on as president. So he stepped back, he resigned, and was still giving advice from the background, you see? But it seems like the current president, Suluhu, is now being influenced by Museveni, just like Ruto has been influenced by Museveni. And that is why we have to keep it a pan-East African struggle. And I always remind comrades in my tweets, I tweet about Kenya when there's abuse, I tweet about Tanzania when there's abuse, and we want to encourage them to also join us. That's why I like the fact that you have Martha Kirua, the prominent Kenyan lawyer, internationally known, and many other international lawyers involved in the defense of Dr. Besigye in Uganda. That is the kind of pan-African, East African cooperation we need. And that is what the Kenyan was doing and the Ugandan activists by going to Tanzania to show solidarity, to witness the kangaroo court trial of the opposition leader in Tanzania. We need to keep that type of East African, pan-East African interaction because we're going to need it in a few months when the dictator steals the election once again in Uganda. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Professor. We would like to go on a moment of silence, 1 minute,
Yes.
and then I'll pass the mic on to my comrade, Ellen Prozel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Profession, and she always fights obviously for the comrades who are jailed, and then all of a sudden she had these mysterious illnesses and now she's in ICU. Actually, she's been bedridden for quite some time, and now the situation has gotten worse, and we suspect there's foul play because obviously when she won, she was perfectly fine, as most of the opposition fighters are always perfectly fine, and then all of a sudden they get this mysterious illnesses and keeps them bedridden for a very long time. So we also send our prayers to Comrade Shamim
prayers
Malende.
as well as let's make sure we tweet about that and make sure that the public know what's going on.
Yes, thank you. Go on.
Sorry, comrade. Yeah, Shamim is the lady MP for Kampala. The Kampala. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Kampala woman MP.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for that update. Thank you.
Thank you. Comrade Ellen Prezo.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ismail, can you confirm that I can be heard?
Loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I want to thank Professor Almadi for your informative, enriching, and educative presentation.
Thank you.
You touched on sensitive topics that is actually making Africa lag behind. But Professor, everything starts and ends with leadership.
Yes, of course.
For the last time that I can remember, Africa gained independence. More of the African countries are in 60+ years since they gained independence. But when you look at the West Africa countries that were once colonized by the French,
yep,
have always been depositing their revenue, their money in France for the
right,
past years that I can remember. And then the ministers of finance could write their budget to France to get a remittance or France to fund their projects.
yeah,
Because of the agreements that they signed before they gained their independence.
yeah,
And yet, when you look at all those countries, I believe they do have professionals and qualified lawyers that could go and argue that against France holding their money.
yeah,
But in one way or the other, they have been silent. It goes back to leadership. Now, when you look at Africa, the 55 countries, the continent is so powerful, is immersed with a lot of wealth, raw materials, natural wealth, and contribute, or because of its existence, these other Europeans and American, other country, China, do able to manufacture and produce phones and all other gadgets that we use,
yeah,
as far as technology is concerned. But up to today, Africa has not had a permanent seat on the Security Council,
yeah.
the UN Security Council. What does that speak to you? Look at the way the African leaders are being treated. Does it tell you, Professor Omadi, and you can advise me and all of us who are here? Does it speak to you that the European, the Chinese, and the Asians and the Americans, the way they design their systems, cannot enable or allow Africa to develop? Other leaders that have come up to really rejuvenate and then empower their people to own their resources, to develop themselves and grow, to create some self-empowerment, have been hounded and they're haunted, they're hunted, they're threatened to be killed. And the rest of other Africas, including the African Union, seem to be silent. Isn't it the question of our mindset and our leadership in the entire Africa? How do you go about that? Before we go to blame the Western powers, because the Western powers are driven and guided by their foreign interests. They don't invest, whether they are using the structure adjustment program or any other program that really put their feet into Africa because of the resources that they get from Africa to empower their industries and create markets for their own products, like China and other countries. What must the African people do to fight in order to have a seat on the dining table, other than always looking out for the Western powers and crying out for them for their demise?
Okay.
It's easy. What Africans we must do is stand up, rise up, fight for our rights, defend them, and fight whoever is trying to stand on our rights, who is trying to crush our rights. Oh, buri avayo kutulemesa okulinyirira eddembe lyaffe okulilemesa oyo mulabe wa Africa mulabe wa bannayuganda tuba tulina okusituka busitusi ne tulwana olw'eddembe lyaffe olw'ekyo kye tulina okuba ne tukirwanirira ne tulwana nga tulwanyisa oyo alinyirira eddembe lyaffe aliyimirirako oba oyo alifootoola alityoboola Africa wejja okutereera ne bali bajja ogamba abantu beeyo bagezi basituse tulina okulaba nga tujjawo abakulembeze bwe bakozesa nga papeti ne tufuna abakulembeze nga ffe tusalawo so si tusalirawo balirala kusalawo nga ffe tusalawo oli bwageza okukolagana nabo nga tugoba tuteekawo omulala in the long run bajja kumanya nti bano abantu bazibuka amaaso. These people now can see what we see. They love what they love. They want Africa. They want Uganda.